For more, let's bring in BMO's head of healthcare research, David Seigerman. Evan, great to have you with us. I know you're skeptical about whether or not this policy goes through, but let's say that it does. I mean, the implication of what President Trump has said is that basically prices abroad will be raised, that the benchmark overseas will be higher, and therefore we will pay lower prices. And that's what he means by it'll just be redistributed. Is that such a bad thing, or is that even possible, given that so many contracts in developed nations are government contracts?
So we're generally of the view that the policy as it stands, there's really not much in the EO actually when it comes to substantive policy. I think a lot of people like the idea of paying less here for drugs in America. But to your point, Melissa, the contracts that exist to cover prescription drugs are contracts between private entities. So think, PBMs, payers, and manufacturers. Of course, you have Medicare, but that's really governed by law. And to really enact something big, you need to change the law, which is what Biden did with the IRA. I was a bit surprised that the EO didn't include a provision to potentially use the IRA price negotiation kind of component and peg it to an MFN most favored nation type pricing, which the EO doesn't have it.
Do you think any of this takes effect, or do you think it has to go through Congress eventually?
As it stands, there's not much policy in the EO, so there's not much to take effect. Yes, there's this 30-day clock to look at what the reference pricing could be. But to your point, I think Congress would really have to act. I also think Congress is somewhat limited in what they can do outside of Medicare, right? They really don't have a ton of power to regulate contracts between private entities. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I believe that would be heavily challenged by the courts. And of course, changing Medicare is also very difficult.
Let's say what you say goes into effect. We wave a magic wand and that EO is gone. Drug pricing, MFN, all that is in the past. It is a non-starter. There's still tariffs involved here. There is still price negotiations through Medicare. I mean, there are other headwinds for this, patent cliffs. They're the fundamentals for the industry. Does the sentiment improve at all if that EO goes away?
I think if MFN goes away, sentiment does improve. Tariffs seem to have come and gone. I haven't heard much of that recently. Of course, that could come back. I think the reprieve for the U.S.-China relationships help kind of the broader sentiment around tariffs. In terms of the fundamentals of the sector, that hasn't really changed. That's why we continue to like a name like Lilly. We always talk about GLP-1s on here. But, as I said last week, I think the sector is still investable, even with some near-term headwinds. And today actually highlighted how those headwinds may not be so bad.